Hi, everyone. We're super excited to be here for Developer Day 2022. My name is Sophie. I'm a strategy and BizOps manager in our ecosystem platform team at Atlassian. And I'm here with Abhi Kishore, a senior software engineer at Atlassian. Abhi, why don't you start by just giving us a bit more detail on how you focus your time here?
Yeah, sure. Lovely to be here with you, Sophie. So for myself, I am currently in the new product space at Atlassian. So prior to that, I was a architect and tech lead on the linking platform kind of smart links team, where we build experiences that help save customers from needing to switch context in this really busy kind of SaaS infused world that we live in. Yeah.
Awesome. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, smart links, and specifically how smart links runs on Forge. So for anyone who's a regular user of Jira or Confluence Cloud, you've probably had a little bit of experience with smart links in action to date. It's a feature that embeds really rich context. Anytime you paste a link on a Confluence page or a Jira issue, it integrates with dozens of providers like Miro, Slack, GitHub, Google Drive, and it's used by a huge amount of Atlassians today. So Abhi, why don't you start by giving us some more detail on what Smart Links actually does and why it's more than just a link unfurler?
Yeah, sure. So I think Smart Links came out of this need. It was a solution designed to meet a very specific customer need, which is, today we're talking on Zoom, and then after this meeting, we're probably going to go be using Confluence. If I'm working with a designer, they'll be using Figma or maybe FigJam. So we kind of take it as almost for granted these days that we're using a multitude of SaaS applications to get our jobs done every day. So to kind of give teams and consumers and users the context they need to be really successful in their role, Smart Links kind of emerged from that need. So when I'm crafting a Confluence page or when I'm crafting a Jira ticket, whatever it may be, typically I'm doing it to communicate with my team and to move work forward with my team. So there's nothing less uninviting as just blue text. And we all know what's behind that blue text is like another app and a whole other set of context. So smart links exist to help you save on switching context. That's really the main value prop that as a link unfurling solution, they offer that context to you, not only for public links on the web, but also for links that only your team may have access to. So just as a small example to demonstrate, like if I'm collaborating with my designer and some engineers on speccing out the next feature we're going to build for Forge, let's say, then we're going to be jamming on a FigJam board or maybe like a Figma design. So if that's the case, then we all need access to that document, and we all should be able to see it in the context of, say, a Confluence page. And with Smart Links, you're able to paste this link, authenticate yourself with Figma, and then come back and actually use it as an entire application within Confluence or Jira, wherever you are. So I think I'd summarize as just saying the value prop is reducing the context you switch and helping you move work forward as a team, not only for things anyone can see, but things only your team can see as well.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so could you give us a brief high-level history of how Smart Links was engineered? What did the original backend look like? What was it built on?
Yeah. So Smart Links was originally built as kind of a couple of microservices. So we had a gateway microservice where you supply a URL to it, and then it would delegate to another microservice, one of 2 or 3 microservices, which are all responsible for actually getting the data for that link and then giving it back to usually like a front-end application of some kind, like say the Confluence front-end. So it was built as a microservice, and especially for our third-party stuff, we had one big microservice where we had, I think at the time, about 8 third-party integrations implemented just in that one microservice. So it's the typical kind of interface where you have a gateway that delegates to other provider services that all implement the same contract. So that's kind of how it was built. And, we definitely hit some pain points, I'll say.
We'll definitely dive into those pain points shortly. But before we get there, is there anything that you think the developer community would be surprised to know about smart links?
Yeah, so I think probably the most surprising is just how much they've been able to scale horizontally on Forge. So like we originally had support for 8 third parties, but today we have support for about 30 and more. And they're all powered by Forge, which is really exciting. I think the other thing is when you're trying to build this kind of service, typically think of it as just like, yeah, you can just build a microservice and make sure it scales well. But it's really tricky when you look at the traffic patterns for link data. So if we're on a page together and then the rest of our team joins on that page, you might be firing maybe 10 requests like 10 requests in total because you have 10 users looking at the same smart link. But now maybe that page is shared with someone in the US time zone. And then when they come online outside of, the time zone maybe you're in, you get more traffic. So the traffic is very bursty, is the way that we would describe it, where there's bursts of traffic, which make scaling characteristics very hard to understand and to plan for. So you really need something that can scale very fast and something that is on demand more so to meet this need better. So that would be the other one. And then the last one I'd probably say is you've probably used the smart link, but you never realized. That's the other thing I find really surprising. So like when you paste a Confluence link in Jira or a Jira link in Confluence, or the same product, Jira in Jira, Confluence, that unfurl you see, you won't even notice, but that is a smart link. And so and the click-through rate and the engagement that users have with them is always very fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned it was originally built on a microservice and then you migrated to Forge a couple of years ago. What was the original motivation to do this? I assume it was related to some of those pain points that you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah, so the main pain points I'd say were definitely the maintenance was very tough. Because when you've got 8 third-party integrations in the one code base, as their APIs evolve, as their authentication mechanisms change, like it's just the rate of change and the way that only some parts need to change more, and then some parts get more traffic than others, and there's a lot of waste and the rate of change is very high. So also reliability gets hard to guarantee because you have some parts of your microservice which are generic and some which are specific to the third party. And so we really wanted to slice this architecture into really small pieces. So yeah, when I look at the motivation for moving to Forge, it was there was many motivations, but one of the primary ones was the computing model was the perfect fit. Like I talked about on demand, and Forge is built on this idea of on demand compute. Also talked about like being able to slice the architecture, and we had very clear boundaries where we wanted to have slices at each third party, and then some shared libraries and things like that. But so yeah, it was a very easy process to think through how would we move to Forge and what would it look like, because the computing model was such a good fit.
And what did that migration process look like in terms of time and effort involved from the team?
Yeah. So we had about 2 engineers on this for 3 months, full time. So it could have taken, so about 3 months. And what we found is the migration process was very much it was per third party. So we we would move one third party and then roll it out to customers and observe, reliability, performance numbers, make sure it's okay. And then we would go to the next third party. And so it took about 3 months for us to move all of the existing, I think, 10 third parties we had piece by piece over to Forge. So it was, all things considered, much easier than introducing another third party in the microservice we had, which probably would have taken roughly the same amount of time. So yeah, we built everything in Forge, and then we had a feature flagged rollout where we would send traffic for, say, the Google Drive smart link only to Forge, and then we would move Miro over, whatever's left over, and it was a gradual ramp up. So 0% would go to Forge, then 10%, then 50% per provider. So that made it really safe, and also meant we had a fallback in place because we had the old microservice.
Yeah, okay. It sounds like you had a pretty quick and seamless migration process, which is really good to hear. So with that behind you, you've obviously now had some time to reflect on how things have changed. How has moving to Forge impacted the way engineering spends their time today?
Yeah. So I think Forge really meant that we could focus on the actual value we want to give our customers much more.
Mm-hmm.
Before, with our microservice, we, as engineers, we had to spend a lot of time thinking about like how to keep the lights on, like, security vulnerabilities, uh, reliability issues, scaling issues. A lot of these things would take up a bit of capacity for us, and it wasn't just for one third party, it would be per third party. So it was a little tricky. When we moved to Forge, some of these still exist, like they're not all gone, and they never will, but a good chunk of this did go away because the infrastructure, we didn't have to do anything to manage the infrastructure anymore. The
Mm-hmm.
security vulnerabilities were more for, like, the few libraries we were now using. And when it comes to, testing became so much easier because when you're on Forge, it's just the function. And as engineers, we know how to write and test functions more than we know how to write and test gigantic services with 10 third parties inside them. So
Yeah, makes sense.
yeah, so that was fantastic for the team. I think scaling as well, like we grew the amount of users actually interacting with smart links by, I think, a magnitude of 10 to 50 times in a very short period of time.
Wow.
And we didn't even think about it. Like, we saw the numbers going up in terms of usage. And when we look at the Forge, kind of the way Forge was behaving, it was very robust, very solid. When there were any niggling issues, the team is like one of the easiest teams to work with when it comes to infrastructure. So we would have a chat, and they'd very quickly jump on anything if it came up. But I don't even remember anything of that nature on an infrastructure level. So I'd say because we moved to Forge, we were able to build a lot more third-party resolvers, and it meant engineers on the team could focus more on what we need to be as a linking platform, which is just a layer that abstracts over all of these third-party providers rather than dealing with the infrastructure and all of the other stuff.
So, Abhi, can you tell us a little bit about how Forge has helped you scale and enhance smart links?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of scalability, we found that there was definitely some performance benefit in moving to the Forge infrastructure. That may have partially been because this microservice had become so unmaintainable and so difficult to work with. But we also found that partly that was also because in our previous microservice, it was very easy for Google Drive requests to affect the latency of, say, Miro requests, because it was all in the one place and in the one box. So if there was very, very intense processing for a Google Drive link, it would also affect anything that came before or after it, mainly after it. So by moving to Forge, it's all kind of isolated, like per function, everything gets its own resources, which is really great. So that really helped with scaling, like our performance. I think one of the metrics we saw for one of the resolvers, we got a latency drop of about, I think it was close to 50%. It used to be 1.5 seconds and it went down to around 800 to 900 milliseconds, which is great. Yeah, which is, you know, when you're calling out to an API that could be anywhere in the world, really, I think it was really positive. Then we also, from a scalability perspective, there was also the cost, which, you know, we did see a big nosedive in that, which yeah, we've discussed. And then I think when it comes to enhancing and scaling further, there was also the developer experience aspect, as well as the external auth module. Those two things are the things that really come to mind. So developer experience is, CLI is really easy to use with Forge, and developer.atlassian.com, like it's a really tight dev loop and experience. Being able to tunnel as well if you haven't used it before. What you can do is with the Forge CLI, you can run a command called Forge Tunnel, which runs your function still in the cloud, and customers of a test site, like if you have a test site and you're actually using your Forge app, it's still installed, but it'll actually go to your local machine. So you can put logs in, you can make sure it's working as you expected. So that was really great. And that helped us scale because we were learning this new programming model, and it meant that we could kind of coach the team piece by piece and really take them through it with a good developer experience. But yeah, the external auth module was a boon. It meant that when we scaled out to more third-party APIs, we would just set some config and we had auth. Like it was really great. Like auth as a whole is that thing that developers know they need to think about, but they don't like to think about it. So yeah, it's great that the Forge runtime kind of takes on a lot of that complexity, because it meant that we were able to, you know, really focus on what we want to do with the data rather than think so much about how to get the data, which is, you know, really big time save.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you've touched briefly on infrastructure. Obviously, one of the biggest changes is that the infrastructure is now hosted on the Forge platform. How has that impacted the cost to run smart links?
Yeah. So when it comes to cost, I'd say it's fundamentally different now. So before, if you had, even if we were only seeing 10 Google Drive links in all of Atlassian Cloud for 24 hours, no customers, just 10 Google Drive Smart Links. We had a microservice that was running all the time, and we would be paying for that for every minute it's running, depending on how much compute and memory it's using. When we moved to Forge, like all of that is now on demand. So as Atlassian as a whole, and you know, as a linking platform, we don't have to, you know, manage any of that infrastructure firstly. But as a whole, like the payment model is very different, where we only have to pay for those 10 invocations and not for the 24 hours where nothing else is happening. So yeah, the cost took a massive nosedive, which was great. Meant more budget for team lunches.
All the important things, hey?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. So let's shift gears and talk about security and compliance. What did your investment in compliance look like before and after, well, before Forge and now that you're on Forge?
Yeah, sure. So before we went to Forge, we did have to also handle like runtime security vulnerabilities. So, you know, upgrading Node.js versions, making sure our Docker images are healthy, a lot of the things that you typically do in a DevOps pipeline. When we moved to Forge, a lot of those things kind of disappeared because the Forge runtime handles those things for you. But we still need to think about, like, say, libraries and dependencies that we personally use as a team. So that would be the only ones that come to mind. but it definitely, I think the investment would have at least halved for us.
Yeah, great. So, and then what about reliability? We've touched on this as well a little bit earlier, but SmartLinks obviously runs at the scale of the Atlassian cloud. So we're talking about millions of requests. How did, I guess, tell us a little bit more around how replatforming helped with stability for SmartLinks?
Yeah. So before, when we were on our microservice, the maximum reliability guarantees we were able to give was probably in the 90 to 95% range, which is, I mean, to be blunt, it's nowhere near the mark, like for our customers. So we were about to embark on a very deep kind of re-architecture exercise, and that's when we started to work with the Forge team and the Forge platform. And after we moved to Forge, all of our SLOs, like we have different tiers for different providers, depending on how much customers rely on them to get their work done. And some of our targets are now 3 nines minimum, so 99.9, which is very difficult to achieve with third-party APIs because you're working with an API you're not familiar with. They can have different failure modes per third party. So by the team was able to really go deep on some of these things because we didn't have to worry about a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah, awesome. That's a huge difference, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So finding and patching vulnerabilities is another area that takes up quite a lot of team resources typically. Has this changed at all for you since moving to Forge?
So when it comes to patching vulns, like we still do that, but we only do it for the dependencies that we rely on. So like for the Google Drive resolver, I think we pull in some typings and maybe a client as well. So we just have to make sure per provider those dependencies are bumped, but that's all we need to worry about. Nothing like, what Node.js version has what vulnerability, none of that. That's all handled by Forge.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pretty positive story so far, but every decision comes with trade-offs, and I'm sure you and the team have experienced some trade-offs with moving to Forge. Could you tell us a little bit about, if any, what those trade-offs were?
Yeah, so obviously moving to Forge is like a shift in the way you build things. So it'd be as similar as, say, moving from maintaining and building a microservice to moving to, say, a Lambda. So yeah, it's a fundamentally different programming model, which for our team, we did have to like skill up the team to really understand like how do you actually think about things in this space. So that was definitely one of the trade-offs where, because we still maintain a few microservices. So we now have these two ways of thinking about providers. But yeah, we had a few ways we mitigated it, but definitely when new engineers join, they have to learn two programming models. I think what I'd say to that is what I observed is most engineers found the Forge programming model easier to understand than our microservices. So, but it was definitely a growing pain at first, but we had to grow into that as a team. I think the other thing is also the runtime. Forge's runtime, when we were using it, it didn't allow us to pull in all the libraries we wanted to use because there were some constraints on what was available in the runtime. So we had to also learn that as we went. So that was another pain point where, we'd pull in some libraries and we'd have some trouble figuring out, what went wrong and why. So a lot of that is now a lot clearer to us and actively, I think, being worked on by the Forge team, from what I understand.
Yeah, great. Okay. I mean, they both sound pretty manageable issues to have, I guess, in retrospect. But thank you for that. I guess to wrap things up, Based on your experience, what advice would you give to a developer who is considering to build on Forge?
Yeah. I'd say just go for it. I'd say, like, for me personally, I was one of the first folks in the linking platform team to actually consider Forge as an option. And what we did is we just spiked it. Like, we spike, for those not familiar, is a very Atlassian word, maybe. is It's just to go away for a few days and just try something and see what you learn. So we did a very targeted spike. We just picked one feature, so the GitHub third-party smart link, and we said, what would it take to build on Forge? We tried to do it, and it seemed easy enough. So we just moved everything else over. And I think really what that speaks to is, I think my personal experience with Forge has been that the developer experience is really great. So I was just able to run a few commands and have a Forge app running. And so that made spiking things really easy. Like that, they already set up half of the stuff I needed. So that was one thing I'd say. It's really easy to get started. So just run a few commands and you'll have a Forge app that you can play with, which is great. I'd also say it's a new programming model. So I'd say you should definitely embrace it. Like, what the Forge model kind of led us to do is to simplify a lot of things. Where we had this gigantic microservice with 10 different things going on. Now we have 10 little Forge functions that have a very defined responsibility. So that was great. And yeah, like being able to think in these smaller units and smaller composable things that are more independently testable, like Forge really lends itself to that. So I definitely say, like, those are the things that I'd say, but mainly just run the installation command and run the template command and just go play with it.
Give it a go.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Abhi, for taking the time to speak with me today. I've certainly learned a lot about smart links, and I know our developer community will really appreciate your candid thoughts on this topic. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, mate. Thank you very much.